"Ma'am, that radio belongs in a garage sale." Recruit Caleb Turner said it with a grin, loud enough for the entire communications training room to hear. A few recruits laughed before they even looked up from their headsets and battery packs. The room was filled with modern equipment laid out in perfect rows. Digital radios, encrypted channel cards, backup batteries, rugged laptops, clean headsets, and laminated checklists that still smelled like fresh ink. Everything looked new, organized, and ready for a training day built around speed, clarity, and control. Then Lieutenant Commander Rachel Morgan placed her radio on the front table, and it looked like it had walked in from another lifetime. The casing was black-gray and scratched at the corners. The antenna had a slight bend near the top. The frequency dial was worn smooth along the edge from years of careful hands. Near the speaker grill, a small silver signal falcon was fixed to the frame, its wings spread around a tiny lightning mark. It was not shiny. It was not decorative. It looked earned. Rachel stood behind it in a clean navy working uniform, her posture straight, her expression calm beneath the cold fluorescent lights. She was 38, white, with a beautiful but restrained face, gray-blue eyes, and dark blonde hair pulled into a regulation bun. Nothing about her asked for attention. That made Caleb think she would not push back. He was 22, smart enough to be useful, young enough to confuse being useful with being right. He leaned toward the table, looking at the old radio like it was a punchline. "Seriously, ma'am," he said, glancing at the recruits beside him. "Are we learning communications or antiques?" The second laugh was smaller. Some recruits watched Rachel now, waiting to see whether she would snap at him, correct him by rank, or call for an instructor. She did none of those things. She rested 2 fingers lightly on the top of the radio, just beside the silver falcon, and looked at Caleb the way a seasoned operator looks at bad weather forming on the horizon. "It carried more than noise," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the room heard it. Caleb's grin held for 1 second longer than it should have. He looked at the scratched case, the bent antenna, the faded labels, and decided silence meant weakness. "With respect, Commander, that thing probably carried static better than anything else." A recruit near the back gave a nervous breath of laughter, then stopped when Rachel turned the radio slightly, angling its rear panel away from the room. The movement was small, protective, almost invisible. But Caleb noticed. His eyes narrowed with curiosity. "What is on the back?" Rachel did not answer. She checked the power switch, then the side latch, then the battery compartment with slow, precise movements. The old radio did not rattle under her hands. It sat solid and quiet on the metal table, like a witness refusing to speak before the right person arrived. "This room is about standards," Caleb said, trying to regain the attention he had started with. "Modern radios, modern systems, modern procedure. If that thing is just sentimental, maybe it should stay out of training." Rachel lifted her eyes to him. There was no anger there. That was what made the room go still. "Some signals should not be mocked," she said. Outside the communications room, footsteps approached in the hallway, steady and measured. Rachel heard them. Her hand paused near the worn frequency dial. Caleb heard nothing yet. He was still staring at the old radio, still searching for the joke, unaware that he was standing inches from the last order that had once kept an entire team from losing each other in the dark. The footsteps in the hallway slowed, then continued past the door, leaving the communications room inside the tension Caleb Turner had created. Rachel Morgan kept her hand near the radio, not hiding it, not presenting it, simply staying close enough that no one would forget it belonged to her. Around the room, the contrast was almost too clear. The recruits stood behind rows of clean equipment that had never been tested beyond instruction manuals and classroom drills. Their digital radios had bright screens and perfect buttons. Their headsets had no sweat worn into the padding. Their batteries were labeled, charged, and lined up with the exactness of a system that had never been asked to work when everything else went wrong. Rachel's old radio sat among them like a scar in a museum of new things. Caleb saw only the scar. Rachel saw the voices it had carried. She adjusted the bent antenna by a fraction, then turned the frequency dial until it clicked softly under her fingers. The sound was small, but it traveled. A recruit near the second row stopped checking his headset and looked up. Caleb leaned back against his table, arms folded, still wearing the half-smile of someone trying to decide whether the room was still his. "Commander, I am not trying to be disrespectful," he said, which was usually what people said right after being disrespectful. "But this is a communications course. We are supposed to learn what actually works now. That thing looks like it belongs in a storage closet." Rachel looked at the old casing. One corner had been scraped down to bare metal. A thin line of heat discoloration ran beneath the speaker grill. The silver signal falcon near the side was dull with age, but the shape remained clear, wings spread around the lightning mark as if guarding the center of the device. "Storage closets hold more history than classrooms sometimes," she said. Caleb gave a short breath through his nose. "History does not transmit." Rachel raised her eyes. "It can, if someone kept the frequency." The answer made the room quieter in a way Caleb did not like. He was used to technology making sense. Either a device worked or it did not. Either a signal was clear or it was not. Either equipment passed inspection or got replaced. He had not yet learned that in the field, usefulness was not always sleek, and old things sometimes survived because someone had trusted them when newer systems failed. Rachel had learned that lesson long before this classroom, long before the clean tables and laminated checklists, long before Caleb's confidence found a target. She had been a junior communications officer then, younger than she felt now, stationed far from any training room, listening to broken channels while weather pressed against the windows and every voice on the net tried to sound calmer than it was. She remembered the way static could feel alive when people were waiting inside it. She remembered counting seconds between replies. She remembered repeating one order until it became the only steady thing left. In the present, she blinked once and the room returned. Caleb had moved closer to the front table, curiosity sharpening behind his arrogance. His eyes kept going to the rear panel she had angled away. "There is something written back there," he said. Rachel did not answer. She checked the side latch, opened it, confirmed the battery compartment, then closed it again with a practiced snap. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "A label." Still no answer. That silence pulled the other recruits in. They began looking past the modern radios and toward the old one, sensing that the joke had touched something deeper than equipment standards. Caleb mistook their attention for permission. "If it is part of the lesson, ma'am, why not show us?" Rachel placed both hands flat on the table, one on either side of the radio. Her voice stayed even. "Because you are still treating it like an object." Caleb's smile faded. "What else is it?" Before Rachel could respond, the footsteps returned in the hallway, heavier this time, no longer passing by. The door handle turned. Rachel's fingers moved once toward the silver falcon, then stopped. Caleb looked toward the entrance at last, unaware that the person about to step inside knew exactly what was written on the back of that radio. The door opened with a soft metal click, and Commander Michael Hayes stepped into the communications room. He was 50 years old, white, broad through the shoulders, with short graying hair and the steady face of a man who had spent most of his career listening before speaking. The recruits came to attention almost at once. Caleb Turner straightened with them, though his eyes still flicked toward the old radio on the front table. Rachel Morgan did not move much. She was already standing with the kind of discipline that did not need to announce itself. Hayes looked across the classroom, taking in the rows of modern radios, headsets, spare batteries, and young faces trying to appear ready. Then his eyes reached the old black-gray radio. Everything in him stopped. It was not dramatic at first. His hands did not shake. His voice did not change because he had not spoken yet. But the room felt the shift. The air around him seemed to grow heavier. His gaze moved over the scratched casing, the bent antenna, the worn frequency dial, and finally the small silver signal falcon fixed beside the speaker grill. He knew it before he saw the rear panel. Rachel saw recognition enter his face and looked down at the table. She had hoped the morning could stay ordinary. She should have known some objects refused to remain ordinary when the right witness walked in. Hayes took one slow step forward. "Commander Morgan," he said. Rachel answered quietly, "Commander Hayes." Caleb looked between them, and for the first time, his confidence began to feel less like control and more like a mistake waiting to be named. Hayes stopped beside the front table, but did not touch the radio. That detail mattered. Everyone saw it. He stood close enough to read the history on its surface and still kept his hands to himself. "I have not seen this unit in years," he said. The recruits shifted slightly. Caleb frowned. "Sir, I was just asking about the equipment standard." Hayes turned his head toward him. Were you asking, Recruit Turner? Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. Hayes waited. The silence did more than pressure him. It sorted him. I made a comment, sir, Caleb admitted. What kind of comment? Caleb glanced at Rachel, then at the radio. A disrespectful one, sir. Hayes held his gaze for 1 second longer, then looked back at the device. Then you should finish what you started. Read what is on the back. Rachel's fingers tightened lightly at the edge of the table. It was the only sign that the request cost her anything. She turned the radio slowly, revealing the rear panel to the room. Near the bottom, beneath scratches and faded tape, a line had been etched into the casing in small block letters. Last order, November 3rd, 2014. Under it was the same silver falcon, smaller, almost hidden near the battery cover. Caleb leaned closer, the earlier joke gone from his face. He read the words silently first, as if hoping they would explain themselves before he had to speak. Hayes did not let him avoid it. Out loud, Caleb swallowed. Last order, November 3rd, 2014. The room became completely still. Hayes stood straighter, not for Caleb, not for Rachel, but for the date. That order, he said, his voice low and controlled, kept 32 sailors alive. A headset slipped from a recruit's hand onto the table with a soft plastic tap. No one reached for it. Rachel looked at the radio, and for one brief second, the classroom vanished from her eyes. The scratched casing was no longer old equipment under fluorescent lights. It was a voice in bad weather, a line through static, a command repeated until people who could not see each other still knew where to hold. Hayes looked at Caleb again. You called it junk because you saw age. Commander Morgan kept it because she remembers who answered. The words stayed in the room after Commander Hayes finished speaking, and no one seemed willing to be the first to disturb them. 32 sailors. Caleb Turner looked at the old radio again, and the scratches across its casing no longer looked like neglect. They looked like proof that it had been somewhere his clean equipment had never been asked to go. Rachel Morgan stood behind the table with her hands relaxed at her sides, but the stillness around her had changed. Earlier, it had looked like patience. Now it looked like restraint holding back a tide of memory. Hayes turned slightly toward the class, choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a place he respected. November 3rd, 2014, was supposed to be a routine coordination exercise during a coastal storm response drill, he said. The public report calls it a communications failure followed by successful recovery. That is accurate. It is also incomplete. Rachel's eyes lowered to the worn frequency dial. Caleb noticed the movement and felt a quiet weight settle in his chest. He had wanted to expose an old device. Instead, he had opened a door into a day people had clearly spent years carrying in silence. Hayes continued. Weather shifted faster than forecast. Multiple teams were operating across distance. The main digital relay became unreliable. Backup channels were crowded, broken, or delayed. People could still hear pieces of each other, but pieces are not enough when everyone is waiting for the same instruction. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn the story into a spectacle. The recruits listened harder because of it. Commander Morgan was younger then, Hayes said. A lieutenant assigned to communications coordination. She did not have the newest system in front of her when the relay dropped. She had that radio, a partial signal, and a room full of people depending on one voice to stay steady. Rachel looked up then, not at Hayes, but at the recruits. Her gray-blue eyes moved across their faces, stopping briefly on Caleb. There was no accusation in them. That made it worse for him. Hayes placed one hand near the radio, still not touching it. The order was simple. Hold position. Follow my signal. Do not break formation. She repeated it through static until every team confirmed. Not once. Not twice. Long enough for the scattered channels to come back together. The room seemed to shrink around the radio. The modern headsets, laptops, and clean equipment faded into background shapes. The old device became the center of the room without moving an inch. Caleb's voice came quietly, stripped of its earlier edge. Sir, was that her voice? Hayes turned to Rachel. The question belonged to her more than him. Rachel did not answer at first. She reached toward the radio and turned it back toward herself, her fingers brushing the silver falcon with a care that made the recruits stand even stiller. It was, she said. 2 words. No pride. No performance. Just fact. Caleb swallowed. And it is still on there? Rachel's hand paused near the power switch. Hayes watched her, waiting, not commanding. The room waited with him. Rachel looked at the radio for a long moment, as if asking permission from the past before letting it speak in the present. Then she said, "Only the last transmission." Caleb lowered his eyes. He understood then that the device was not being kept because it was useful for training. It was being kept because once, when every clean system became uncertain, one imperfect signal had been enough. Rachel turned the volume knob. The speaker gave a low crackle. Static filled the room, thin and rough, like wind moving through a broken wire. No one laughed. No one breathed loudly. Then, beneath the noise, a younger version of Rachel's voice came through, calm, controlled, and unmistakable. "Hold position. Follow my signal. Do not break formation." The words were brief. The recording ended almost as soon as it began. But when the static faded, the room did not feel like a classroom anymore. It felt like 32 unseen people had just passed through it and left their silence behind. The last transmission faded into a thin hiss, then into nothing. No one in the communications room moved. The old radio sat on the table with its bent antenna and scratched casing, no louder than before, no cleaner, no newer, and yet it had changed the entire room. Caleb Turner stared at it, as if the device had become a person he had insulted to its face. A few minutes earlier, he had seen junk. Now he had heard a voice steady enough to hold people together when newer systems had gone uncertain. Commander Michael Hayes let the silence remain. He knew silence could teach what explanation could not. Rachel Morgan turned the volume knob back down and rested her hand near the silver signal falcon. Her face was composed, but her eyes had gone somewhere distant, not lost, only remembering. Caleb noticed that, and the shame in him deepened. He had wanted to make the room laugh. Instead, he had made a room full of recruits hear the difference between noise and service. Hayes looked across the class. "That is why we do not judge equipment by shine," he said. "And we do not judge people by what they choose not to explain." The recruits stood straighter, some because they understood, others because they were beginning to. Caleb looked down at the modern radio on his own table. Its screen was clean. Its buttons were perfect. He had trusted it because it looked ready. He had doubted Rachel's because it looked old. For the first time that morning, he understood how shallow that kind of certainty could be. "Commander Morgan," he said quietly. Rachel looked at him. He did not hide behind a grin this time. He did not glance at the others to see who was watching. He stood alone inside his mistake. "I was wrong." The words were plain, and that made them stronger. "I called it junk. I treated it like a joke. I did not know what it carried." Rachel did not answer immediately. She let the apology breathe long enough to become real. Hayes watched him with a steady expression, measuring not the words, but whether the young recruit could stand in the discomfort he had earned. Caleb kept his eyes on Rachel. "I am sorry, ma'am." Rachel's hand moved once over the radio casing, stopping beside the worn frequency dial. "Do you know why that order worked?" she asked. Caleb hesitated. "Because they heard you? Because they trusted the voice before they understood the situation," Rachel said. "Trust is built before the storm. In small rooms. During training. In the way you speak. In the way you listen. In the way you treat things that cannot defend themselves." Caleb absorbed it without nodding too quickly. The old version of him would have answered fast to escape the moment. This one stayed quiet. Rachel continued, her voice even. "You are learning communications. That does not mean learning how to press buttons. It means learning how to carry clarity when everyone else is fighting confusion." The sentence settled over the equipment tables, over the headsets, over the recruits who suddenly seemed less interested in finishing first and more interested in getting it right. Caleb straightened. Slowly, carefully, he brought his hand up in a salute. It was not theatrical. It was not for attention. It was the cleanest apology his training knew how to offer. Rachel returned it with controlled precision. Hayes did not interrupt. When Caleb lowered his hand, Rachel turned the radio so the back panel faced the class one last time. "Last order, November 3rd, 2014. Remember this," she said. "A signal does not need to be perfect to guide people home, but the person sending it has to be steady." No one laughed after that. The room had entered as a classroom full of equipment. It had become a place where every recruit understood that some objects do not survive because they are advanced. They survive because someone refused to let silence win. The communications lesson continued, but it no longer felt like a lesson about machines. Rachel Morgan moved down the rows of recruits while Commander Hayes stood near the front table, watching quietly as the room found its rhythm again. The old radio remained beside the modern units, its rear panel turned away now, the silver signal falcon catching a narrow strip of fluorescent light. Nobody joked about it. Nobody asked to touch it. The recruits adjusted headsets, checked battery contacts, read channel cards, and tested call signs with a new kind of care. Caleb Turner stood at his station with his shoulders square and his eyes lowered to the checklist in front of him. He did not rush. He did not perform. When the recruit beside him skipped a verification step and reached for the transmit button, Caleb stopped him with one hand held low, not aggressive, just firm. "Confirm the channel first," he said. The other recruit frowned. "We already did." Caleb looked at the old radio at the front of the room, then back at the checklist. "Then confirm it again." Rachel heard it, but she did not turn immediately. She let the correction stand on its own. Growth looked small when it was real. Hayes noticed too, and the corner of his mouth moved almost into a smile before discipline pulled it back. The class moved into a simulated relay exercise. No real emergency, no danger, only training pressure. One team at the front reading coordinates, one team in the middle relaying instructions, one team in the back confirming message integrity. The first attempt was messy. Voices overlapped. A call sign was missed. Someone repeated the wrong number and had to be corrected. Normally, Caleb would have been the first to point out another recruit's mistake with a joke sharp enough to make the room laugh. This time, he raised his hand and said, "Reset from the last confirmed transmission." Rachel looked at him then. His face was serious, not embarrassed, not proud, simply focused. "Good," she said. One word. It meant more than praise because she did not give it easily. They ran the exercise again. Cleaner. Slower at first, then steady. The room began to sound less like a group of individuals competing for attention and more like a net learning to hold. Rachel walked behind the final row, listening to the calls pass from voice to voice. She watched Caleb write down each confirmation before speaking. She watched him wait until the line was clear before transmitting. She watched him learn that silence was not empty space, but part of communication when used with discipline. At the front of the room, the old radio remained silent, but its presence seemed to guide the pace. After the third run, Hayes stepped forward. "That is the difference," he said. "Noise fills a room. Communication carries people through it." The recruits absorbed the line without needing to write it down. Caleb looked toward Rachel. "Commander," he said, "permission to ask a question." Rachel stopped beside his table. "Ask." He kept his voice respectful. "How did you keep your voice steady back then?" The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence was not tense. It was listening. Rachel looked toward the old radio. For a moment, her younger voice seemed to linger in the speaker grill, still holding formation across time. "I remembered that panic travels fast," she said. "So calm had to travel faster." Caleb nodded slowly, as if the words had found a place deeper than memory. Rachel continued walking, and the class returned to work. The old radio did not transmit again that morning. It did not need to. Its final order had already crossed the room and changed the way every recruit heard silence. By noon, the communications room had become quieter in the right way. Not uncertain, not afraid, focused. The recruits worked through relay drills with their sleeves rolled neatly, their notebooks open, and their voices lowered into something more precise than confidence. Rachel Morgan stood near the front table, the old radio resting beside her left hand, while Commander Hayes observed from the side wall with his arms folded and the look of a man watching a lesson take root. Caleb Turner no longer tried to own the room. He listened to it. When another recruit spoke over a transmission, Caleb raised 2 fingers and waited until the line cleared. When a call sign came through incomplete, he did not guess. He asked for confirmation. When a teammate grew frustrated after repeating the same coordinate 3 times, Caleb said, "Slow is fine. Wrong is not." Rachel heard the words and let them pass without comment, but Hayes glanced at her. They both understood what had happened. The old radio had done more than play a recording. It had rearranged the meaning of readiness. After the final relay exercise, Rachel collected the channel cards and placed them in a stack beside the radio. "Communications is not about sounding in control," she said. "It is about being useful when control is slipping away." The recruits stood behind their tables, tired from concentration rather than movement. Their modern radios were still lined up in front of them, but none of the devices looked as complete as they had that morning. They were tools now, not trophies. Caleb looked at the scratched casing on Rachel's radio and noticed details he had missed before: a small dent near the battery cover, a faded strip of tape along the side, the way the frequency dial stopped firmly at certain points because someone had cared enough to keep it working long after most people would have replaced it. Rachel placed the radio into a padded case, leaving the silver signal falcon visible for a moment before the flap covered it. Caleb watched, then looked down at his own clean training unit. He picked it up with both hands. That small change did not escape Hayes. "Recruit Turner," Hayes said. Caleb straightened. "Yes, sir." "Status of your equipment?" Caleb checked the screen, the battery lock, the channel setting, and the headset lead before answering. "Serviceable, sir." Verified twice. "Ready for instruction." Hayes held his gaze. "Status of your judgment?" A few recruits looked over, but Caleb did not flinch. Earlier, he might have smiled. Now he answered plainly. "Under correction, sir." The room stayed silent. Hayes gave a small nod. "Keep it that way." Rachel lifted the padded case from the table. "That is enough for today." The class began to secure their gear, but nobody moved carelessly. Headsets were coiled instead of tossed. Batteries were checked before storage. Radios were set down gently, not because they were fragile, but because the recruits had learned that usefulness deserved respect. Caleb waited until the others had begun lining up near the door. "Commander Morgan," he said. Rachel turned. "Yes, recruit." He stood straight, his voice lower than before. "I will remember the order." Rachel looked at him for a long second. "Remember why it worked?" Caleb nodded. "Because they trusted the voice." "Because the voice stayed steady," Rachel said. Then she walked toward the door, the old radio in its case at her side, leaving behind a room where every recruit now understood that a signal did not become strong by being loud. It became strong by being clear when people needed it most. The hallway outside the communications room was cooler than the classroom, quiet except for the distant sound of boots moving across polished floors and an instructor calling cadence somewhere beyond the building. Rachel Morgan walked with the padded case in her right hand, the old radio resting inside, silent now, but no lighter than before. Commander Michael Hayes fell in a step beside her without speaking at first. He had the patience of someone who understood that not every silence needed to be filled. They passed framed photographs of past training classes, unit plaques, and clean display cases holding equipment that had earned a place behind glass. Rachel did not look at them for long. She had never liked the way history changed once people polished it. Things became easier to admire when the fear, uncertainty, and responsibility had been wiped from the surface. The old radio still had its scratches. That was why she trusted it. Hayes glanced at the case. "You could let the schoolhouse display it," he said. Rachel kept walking. "They would make it look too clean." Hayes gave a low, quiet breath, almost a laugh. "You always did prefer useful over ceremonial." "Ceremonial has its place. But not for that radio." Rachel stopped near a window overlooking the training courtyard. Outside, Caleb Turner and the other recruits were forming into small teams for an afternoon navigation and communication exercise. Each team carried modern radios, laminated maps, and message cards. From this distance, they looked like every other class at the start of every other drill: young, alert, unfinished. Rachel watched Caleb check the battery lock on his radio, then wait while his teammate confirmed the channel. He did not rush him. He did not make a joke. That mattered. "Not yet," she said. Hayes followed her gaze. "He changed fast." "No," Rachel said. "He corrected fast. Change takes longer." Hayes nodded, accepting the difference. In the courtyard, the instructor raised a hand, and the teams began moving between marked stations. The exercise was simple, designed to test message discipline under mild pressure. Nothing dangerous, nothing heroic, just enough confusion to reveal habits. One team stumbled immediately when two recruits tried to talk over each other. Another forgot to repeat the call sign. Caleb's team moved slower, but cleaner. When a message came through incomplete, Caleb did not guess. He looked at the radio, took one breath, and said, "Say again from the last confirmed word." Rachel heard none of it through the glass, but she could read the posture, the pause, the decision. The lesson had traveled farther than the room. Hayes looked at her. "That order is still working." Rachel's fingers tightened around the case handle. Inside, beneath padding and canvas, the scratch radio carried its last transmission in silence. "That is the point," she said. "The right order should outlive the moment." Down below, Caleb's team reached the final station. They were not first. A faster team finished ahead of them and started celebrating too early, only to be sent back for a missed confirmation. Caleb's team waited until every message was verified, then reported complete. The instructor checked the card, paused, and nodded. "Clean." Rachel saw Caleb exhale, not with pride, but with relief earned the right way. Hayes stepped back from the window. "You taught them more than communications today." Rachel looked at the courtyard one last time. Communications is never just communications. She turned from the window and continued down the hallway, the radio case at her side. Behind her, the class kept moving through the drill, voices measured, signals checked, corrections made before mistakes became habits. The old radio did not need to speak again. Its last order had already become something stronger than sound, a standard moving from one person to the next. By late afternoon, the courtyard exercise had ended, and the communications schoolhouse settled into the quiet that comes after a lesson has done more than fill time. Recruits moved through the hallway in pairs, carrying radios with both hands, returning batteries to chargers, coiling headset cables instead of dropping them into bins. Nobody ordered the extra care. That was how Rachel Morgan knew it had taken root. Caleb Turner was the last to leave the courtyard. He stood near the equipment return table, checking his radio one final time before handing it over to the petty officer on duty. The device was clean, modern, and ordinary, but he treated it like a responsibility instead of an object. When another recruit beside him muttered that the extra checks were slowing everyone down, Caleb did not laugh with him. He simply said, "Fast does not matter if the message fails." The recruit looked at him, then looked at the radio in his own hand, and checked the battery lock again. From the schoolhouse window, Commander Michael Hayes saw it and gave a small nod. Rachel stood beside him with the padded case resting on the windowsill, her hand on the handle. Inside, the old radio was silent, the scratched casing and bent antenna hidden beneath canvas. The silver signal falcon was no longer visible, but its weight remained in the room between them. "He will remember," Hayes said. Rachel watched Caleb return his gear, step back, and wait until his teammate finished instead of walking ahead. "Maybe," she said. "Remembering is a daily decision." Hayes looked at her, then at the case. "You say that like someone taught it to you the hard way." Rachel did not answer. She looked across the courtyard where the sun was lowering behind the flagpole, turning the windows gold. There were memories she could speak about and memories that still belonged to the people who had answered through static on November 3rd, 2014. She did not need to reopen all of them for the lesson to remain true. Downstairs, Caleb paused near the exit when he saw Rachel and Hayes come into the corridor. He straightened immediately, not with panic or performance, but with respect. Rachel stopped in front of him. For a second, the hallway felt like the communications room again, only quieter. "Recruit Turner," she said. "Commander," he answered. His eyes moved once to the padded case, then returned to her face. "I will not call old gear junk again." Rachel studied him. "That is a start." Caleb nodded, accepting that it was not enough by itself. "And I will ask what it carried." Something in Rachel's expression softened, not into a smile, but into acknowledgement. "Better." Hayes looked away slightly, giving the moment room. Caleb stood there for another breath, then brought his hand up in a clean, respectful salute. Rachel returned it with the same controlled precision she had shown all day. When the salute ended, Caleb stepped aside and let her pass. Outside, the evening wind moved across the courtyard and lifted the flag above the schoolhouse. Rachel walked toward the equipment archive, not to lock the radio away forever, but to place it where it could be brought out again when another class needed more than instructions. Hayes walked beside her. "Still not ready for a display case?" he asked. Rachel looked down at the padded case. "Not while it is still transmitting." Hayes almost smiled. "It has not transmitted since this morning." Rachel glanced back through the glass doors. Caleb was helping another recruit coil a headset properly, patient now, quieter now, listening before speaking. "Yes, it has," she said. "The old radio never made another sound that day. It did not need to. Its last order had moved from a scratch speaker into a room full of young service members, then into their hands, their habits, their voices, and the way they treated every signal after that. Before they called something useless, they would ask what it had carried. Before they mocked silence, they would wonder who it had guided. And long after the classroom lights went dark, the lesson remained. Some signals survive because someone stayed steady long enough for others to find their way home.